Well, the first thing I need to say is that as a church minister, I am very concerned and very sad for the suffering and the illness and the death that has happened as a result of this terrible virus. I am acutely aware of it as the minister of a small church of about 50 adults. We've had 3 families have had deaths in those families.
Wow.
Directly as a result of the virus. And this afternoon, after this conversation, I'll be off to take my second socially distanced funeral. So I'm acutely aware that this virus is real, it's serious, and it causes terrible suffering and pain. So I have questions and concerns about how the government have handled this crisis, but those concerns in no way go to suggest that I don't think we should be being careful and being wise and prudent. We should take this virus very seriously. But I think the fundamental criticism I have of the government's handling of the lockdown is that they have failed in any meaningful or obvious way to guard and protect religious freedoms. So we should be very concerned about things like the freedom of speech and the freedom of thought. And even before this virus came onto our radar, we were rightly worried about it. We were seeing preachers arrested on the streets of our country. We were seeing social care workers losing their jobs because of expressing their thoughts on social media, expressing beliefs which are just basic Christian religious beliefs.
Yeah.
So we're right to be concerned about those things. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that freedom of speech and freedom of thought are actually built upon the foundation of freedom of religion.
Right.
It is freedom of religion, which that is where you test and you explore the true nature and extent of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And freedom of religion requires not just the freedom of people to hold their personal religious beliefs privately and secretly. Freedom of religion requires the freedom to gather together to worship according to your beliefs.
Yeah.
It requires freedom from government interference in your meetings. And the government basically just trampled forward in size 11 boots in a fairly catatonic state over the religious freedoms in our country in the last month or two. And I'm pretty worried about what the possible consequences could be in the coming years.
Right. And so what's your view on terms of, should churches be allowed to open? Would you like to open your church in some form or other at this point? Or, bearing in mind what you said about the effects of the virus and so on?
I think that if you'd asked me that question before lockdown was begun, then I would have suggested that there should be a very clear, circumscribed piece of guidance from the government towards churches about maybe taking a break from gatherings for 2 to 3 weeks, about some suggestions about how to conduct any gatherings in a safe way.
Yeah.
And then there should be, and that should be in a very clearly circumscribed piece of guidance rather than legislation. And then there should have been a real move to prioritize getting back to normal. In the situation we are in now, people have been terrified and have been sort of pushed into a corner where we're now kind of having to work back from considerable misunderstandings. There's a lot of debate now about the significance of singing, about the nature of how many air molecules spread in a massive church building. All kinds of debates and problems now that we wouldn't have had if the government had been duly cautious and respectful about trampling into the area of religious freedoms as thoughtlessly as it did. So in the situation we're in now, which I think we never should have been in,
right?
In the situation we're in now, I think that probably the best thing that could be done is the government should be expressing a serious commitment and a very meaningful priority of allowing and helping churches to have some kind of gathered worship meetings again as soon as possible. Timelines, guidance, practical advice, that's all welcome. But as we sit currently, what's been issued is legislation which puts churches on a level with
cinemas,
cafes, cinemas, theaters, and that is a real insult to the many people in our country who have religious beliefs, a real trampling on the natures of religious freedoms. And I think they need to work really hard, really fast to reverse gear that.
Yeah, it strikes me as well that churches are allowed to run food banks, for example, trusted to run food banks. But even on Monday, like, you'll be allowed to gather. Well, you won't be allowed to gather. You know, one person can pray on their own in church. If two people pray, that's an informal prayer meeting. That's illegal. You know, and so it's crazy. It's like almost like they're deliberately, it feels like, trampling on spirituality and spiritual needs and spiritual life, whilst allowing churches to run food banks and things like that as if that's totally fine. I mean, this is the extraordinary deprioritization of spiritual things, isn't it, Peter?
Yeah, and it's quite bizarre and disappointing, really, that it's the Conservative Party that is presiding over that, because for those who are interested in looking into the history of the Conservative Party in England and some of the ideas that the Conservative Party took a hold of 15 or so years ago, you look into things like compassionate conservatism, you look at the big community ideas, and there were very helpful conversations then about the way Christians and churches do social good in society, and they do it motivated and energized by their spiritual faith and their prayer life and their relationship with God. And it is deeply counterproductive to try to segment those off and separate them off. But the way this current crisis is being handled, the inconsistencies in approach show that we have people at the heart of government taking decisions who simply do not understand the nature of religious freedoms and religious beliefs, and therefore cannot really be trusted to protect freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and other freedoms that actually we look around us today, we see them under great strain and duress.